As he went along, he saw a blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus. "But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I'm in the world, I am the light of the world." After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam." This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him came begging, asking him, saying, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." "How then were your eyes open?" they asked. He replied, "The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash, so I went and washed, and then I could see." "Where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know," he said. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was the Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees asked him how he had received his sight. "He put mud on my eyes," the man replied, "and I washed and I now see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others asked, "How can a sinner perform such signs?" So they were divided. Then they turned again to the blind man. "What do you have to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." The man replied, "He's a prophet." They still did not believe that he had been blind and received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. "Is this your son?" they asked. "Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that he can now see?"
So there's this kind of question of what would they have to admit. As the chapter continues to unfold, the formerly blind man's parents actually come, and they're really afraid of admitting anything. They just say, "Well, yeah, he was born blind, but we don't want to go much further than that," because they know they're going to get kicked out of the temple. So we see the formerly blind guy comes in, and he does this great, if you want to read a passage with lots of sarcasm in it, his responses are just really snarky. I love it. And it's one of my favorite things about this text. He just goes after them. "What, do you want to be his disciples too?" Like, hey. So, but eventually he has this encounter with Jesus at the end, and Jesus says, "Do you believe?" And he says, "Well, show me the one." Well, he says, "The one you're seeing and talking to is the one." And he worships Jesus. So that's where this is all leading to in this passage. And I love the order of this, because sometimes we think that Jesus waits for us to get all our act together, to get everything all right and lined up. But Jesus meets us in the midst of the messiness of life. And Jesus takes us where we're at and brings us home, brings us into that place of worship. So, yeah, a little note here. Consider telling you a story. So I got to tell you, it's a fun story. When I was first saved, I started going to this Pentecostal church. And we had this Sunday school class that I went to. It was kind of an adult Sunday school class. I was 19 at the time, but we thought we were adults. So I showed up there, and there was this one guy who used to teach, and he told this story, but he was obviously really disturbed about this story. And the story was about this lady that had come to one of their kind of tent meetings, and they knew her. She smoked like a chimney, she swore like a sailor, and she came in and she had cancer. And they prayed for her, and she felt that she got healed from the cancer, and she started swearing. And she went out over there swearing. And to the best of their ability, they don't know that she ever gave her heart to Jesus, but she was healed, and they were so troubled by that. But God meets us in the midst of the messiness and moves through life with us and takes what we give. So I love that about Jesus. So let's go back to the beginning of the text just a little bit here. As he walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed." In this text, the disciples do what we often do. We look for the reasons why the world is so messed up. And that's the human story. That's the human arc here. We love that question why. And we live in that question why, because it protects us from having this kind of different approach that Jesus is going to present here. And because I believe Jesus is challenging that immediate response of trying to find a way to reason it out, because if we reason it out, we don't have to do anything about it. And Jesus is calling us to something deeper here. So we can read the second part of this response of Jesus in two ways. We can either take a kind of fatalistic approach to it and say that Jesus is saying that this guy was born blind just so I can look cool. I don't think that's what's going on. I think that he's saying that so that we can recognize that Jesus came into the world precisely for people like this man born blind, precisely for moments like this where God's glory could be manifest, and that Jesus encounters us for just those kinds of moments to change us. I've got my little slogan there. God comes to take tragedy, sin, pain, the worst the world can throw at us. God comes to redeem all of those things. It's amazing how God steps into our lives and begins to undo the ravages of all our bad choices. I'll tell you a story a little later on where God did an interesting walkthrough with me with something that happened when I was younger. When we walk through life, our responses to the messed up state of things, including our own hearts, is either one of fear and blame, to use Paulo's brilliant language from our conversation on Friday, or it's a response of expectation and participation with God in the redemption of the world. That's what theologians like myself like to call hope. Do we have an attitude of hope? And I think that's what Jesus is challenging us, rather than to try and rationalize and get caught up in the world that doesn't allow us to do anything, but to have hope that changes the world. Hope is not simply a sense that God will ultimately fix everything. It's a conviction that God is already at work undoing the ravages of sin and inviting us to participate with him in this amazing work. That's what God is. That's what he's calling us to rethink here. So one of the tragedies, I think, of modern evangelicalism, and I consider myself an evangelical, is that we've truncated the good news of the gospel. We've reduced it to some sort of fire insurance that is really only good news in the flimsiest of senses. So save me a seat on that bus to heaven, That's a far cry from the notion of gospel that is akin to the news of victory in battle. Because that language, that word gospel, comes from that notion of hearing of a victory in battle. And what would that orient us to do? One of the theologians I like, he's actually a United Church theologian, John Douglas Hall. He reminds us that the cross is planted in the ground. And that's significant because it has implication for all of creation. And he reminds us that in John 3:16, the passage we love so much, the word there that we think about, we often think about as meaning people. The word world there is the far more expansive word cosmos. It's the whole of the created order. God so loved everything that was created good that God actually stepped into creation to begin this work of undoing, this redemptive work of undoing the ravages of sin. And it begins with the cross. We sang about that already today, and I was happy that we sang past the cross to the resurrection. Because Jürgen Moltmann, my favorite theologian, sorry, I'm going to bring in all these theologians, I just love these guys. He reminds us that the answer to the cross is always the resurrection. The cross is representative of all the worst that the sinful world can throw at us. Death. One of the most horrible ways imaginable to die. This death is overturned by God and made part of an amazing story. And that's what we call redemption. So I have a friend, just to give you a sense of how this orientation works, because I could tell you lots of stories where I failed to pick up that redemptive thread. But I have a friend who was struggling. He was part of a community that was a tough love community. It was a bad fit for him. And he was being ground under by the community. It meant well, but he was being ground under by it, and he was starting to push back. And so we had chatted with him, and actually we had agreed that he could come and live with us. This is a while back. And so So we had made arrangements at the end of the month when he would be done his rent, he would come and live with us. We came home, I think from some church event, and there was a message on the machine from him saying, "Oh, yeah, they kicked me out. I don't know what I'm going to do." You know, he was like a week away from the end of the month, and I just turned to Sharon and I said, "Look, I'm going to go in the car and I'm going to just drive and try and find him." She's like, "Yeah, okay, whatever." Because I often have these crazy ideas to do things like that. But I was thinking redemptively, I wasn't intentionally doing that, but I think this is a good example of a moment where maybe God helped me to get it, more so than I deliberately got it. But I got in my car and began to drive, and I said, "Stay by the phone in case he calls, call me." So I got in the car, and as I'm driving, I'm like praying, "God, lead me to him." I can just imagine how broken he is, how much he needs to, he needs to hear from you. And so I feel like, turn left here. So I turn left and turn right here. So I'm driving through this little residential area, and I come back out on the road I was, and I'm like thinking, oh, obviously I'm missing it. I'm right back where I started. Okay, I got to figure out another plan. I'm driving along, and I just feel like I should keep going. And then I drove by a street that we had gone to a coffee shop on, and I said, "Oh, if this doesn't pan out, I'm going to that coffee shop. I bet you he's going to be at that coffee shop." So I kept driving down Meadowlands, actually, and I got to Prince of Wales, and then I went, "Oh, there's a Tim Hortons right here." So I pulled out, and I pulled into the Tim Hortons, and he's standing out in front of the Tim Hortons. And I pull in, and I talked to him. I said, God directed me here to tell you that he loves you. And, he's like, "Man, I was just in the alley. If you had to come any sooner, I would have missed you." So if I hadn't have gone through that residential, maybe I was hearing something. I don't know. But there was this redemptive attitude, and I like to tell that story because that didn't fix his life. That helped him out for a good chunk of things. And in fact, he's had a really rough go of it. And he has times where he's walking in grace and times when he's walking far away from grace. And it's funny because God keeps bringing him back into our orbit. And we keep reminding him, "Remember that time that God loved you and showed his love for you so much that we could come and, find you and tell you?" So it was one of those moments where we pick up that redemptive thread and we partner with God because God is already at work drawing people, trying to restore people, trying to bring us into a better relationship. This redemptive work is what we're invited to as Christians. Verse 9, Jesus goes on, "We must work the works of the one who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." So when Jesus comes, God begins telling a new story in our lives. We are the presence of Christ in this world. We're called to walk this out. I love the language of the Gospels where Jesus says, "I do the things that I see the Father doing." Isn't that a great invitation for us to do the things that we see God doing? When Jesus comes, God begins telling a new story in our lives. Our sins and failures are taken up into a new story of redemptive opportunity. So I want to tell you a story because I'm a really geeky guy, and I love kind of putting that out there. And one of the things I love, one of my geekdoms, is stamp collecting. But I had a troubled youth. I mean, I teach at a university, but I threw away my youth to drugs and all kinds of stuff. And in my background, I was collecting stamps, and I had found this rarity. Actually, I looked it up to try and see if I could replace this thing, and I cannot afford to replace this thing. But I sold it for drug money when I was a kid. And I developed all this shame around my stamps that they ended up in my parents' closet for years. And one day, after I'd met my wife, her father was an avid stamp collector. And him and I, he did not want his daughter to marry a preacher. He did not see this as a lucrative career. He didn't think this was he wanted something more. So I was never really, we didn't connect. We had this kind of barrier. And I went home, I remember going home that summer, and my parents said, "Here, take this back. We don't want this in our closet anymore." So I get up and I'm like, what do I do with this? What do I do with this collection that I've messed it up? I tore it apart and sold off things that I shouldn't have, to do things I shouldn't have. It was this great reminder of the depths that my life had fallen into. And so I decided I'm going to clean up this collection so that I can show it to Jerry, Sharon's dad. And I began to sit down at night and work on this collection, pulling out all the, putting it back together into a nice shape that I could, have some pride in, actually. And many times I'd be doing this, and I would just sense that God was sitting there with me as we began to go through my life, reminding me that there's so many things in my life that God has had to walk through and redeem and change and transform. So what was amazing about that was that after I had cleaned it up and I took it over and I took some of it over to show to Jerry, it created this bond between me and him that I never would have had otherwise. And in fact, he died a few years after that. So it was like this precious opportunity that I had because of willing to step into this redemptive relationship. Anyway, that's very geeky, but I had to tell you that story because, this is that redemptive walk. It changes us and it changes those around us. I love how it goes on. Never since the world began, and this was in my personal devotional life, I actually read the lectional from the Roman tradition. I read the lectional readings and prayers for the day, and this was the response. Never, and this is the man who was born blind, it's a little snarky. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered him, "You were born entirely in your sins and are trying to teach us," and they drove him out. It's not always the most popular option. But wouldn't you rather be doing what God is doing? Jesus heard that they had driven him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" And he answered, "And who is he, sir? Tell me that I may believe in him." Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he." And he said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. Jesus said, "I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind." And some of the Pharisees near him heard this. They're not going to be too happy. And they said to him, "Surely we are not blind, are we?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would not have sin. But now you say, 'We see,' your sin remains." I want us to hear the end of this chapter as a confrontation, as a challenge to how we look at life. Jesus is saying that when we say we see, when we think we know how the world is messed up, when we think we've figured all those things out, that we're actually blind because we're not paying attention to what God is doing. We're paying attention to the way things are. We're looking at the wrong things and missing the forest for the trees. When our response is to look for why instead of looking for the opportunity, we cannot see what God is actually doing and where God is in the midst of tragedy, pain, sin, and brokenness. So I'm going to end with an insight and open up some conversation. This comes out of liberation theology. If you want to see God, then go to the poor. Go to the broken. Go to the ones in need, the ones who know their need. Can I pray for us? And then we'll chat. God, would you open up our eyes to see what you're doing? Lord, would you give us hearts to participate in all that you're doing? That we might say at the end of the day that we did what we saw the Father doing. Come, Jesus.